Well, as promised, I wanted to get started right at 12:45, so we're at time. I am really delighted to be introducing Jeremiah Ariaz to lead us through what I would describe as a really important, kind of partly nostalgic, but also partly about the state of rural newspapers. Jeremiah received his BFA from the Kansas City Art Institute and his MFA from the State University of New York at Buffalo. His photographs examine the construct of American identity within personal, community, and political contexts. He has exhibited in solo and group exhibitions internationally. For one of his most recently completed projects, Louisiana Trail Riders, he was the recipient of an Atlas grant, the Michael P. Smith Award for Documentary Photography from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, the 2018 South Arts Finalist Prize, and named the 2018 Louisiana State Fellow. Today he is presenting The Fourth Estate, a project that features small-town newspaper offices across his home state of Kansas. As he writes, newspapers play a critical role in our shared democracy. The photographs celebrate the civic function, labor, and technology at the heart of local newspapers' production, while also documenting an industry in freefall. Today, in contrast to much of the country, newspapers are still operating in towns nearly every 20 to 30 miles across the Kansas prairie. Included are a selection from 135 offices, mostly in operation. I'm pleased to present Jeremiah and his nostalgic journey, portraying the lifeblood of small towns in rural Kansas, their newspapers. Jeremiah.
Thank you so much, Terry. I'm really grateful to be here and for the invitation to show this work with you. And I also just want to thank everybody who worked so hard to make this possible. Thank you, and thank you to all the organizers that are here and volunteers that give their time. So I feel like this conversation today is going to be a little bit of an extension of a number of conversations that I got to have last night at a dinner. And so I also just want to thank our very generous host, Tom and Catherine, for that. And it generated a lot of conversation, and it really laid a groundwork for this to hopefully feel like a continuation of a conversation that's already started. So I'm going to show these photographs of offices in Kansas and tell how and why I got there, and show some of the recent outcomes from this project. So the U.S. is losing an average of 2 newspapers a week. A quarter of the nation's papers have closed in the last 15 years. This is a project I've been pursuing with urgency since beginning to photograph newspaper offices since the run-up to the 2020 presidential election. It was one subject among many that I was photographing, seeking to make a kind of record of the country at this historic moment, but also to search for visible signs of democracy. And I was photographing in places like election campaign offices and newspaper offices, and also thinking about places like the militarized southern border and sites of civil unrest. And so that became a very large project, and the newspapers stood alone. I wanted to make that a singular body of work. And so after expanding it from the battleground states of the country to nationally, I ultimately decided to rein that back in and focus on my home state of Kansas. And I felt that this one subject, these newspaper offices, were able to speak to concerns that I have about democracy and about community, especially in rural America. James Joyce once said that in the particular is contained the universal. If I could photograph the newspapers in the geographic center of the country, in the heart of America, I felt they could be a window to consider journalism and community newspapers nationwide. In 2022, with a semester sabbatical, I'd photographed newspaper offices across the state. I view these unassuming offices as beacons of democracy in a divided America. And I'm not a reporter, I'm not a photojournalist. I approach the subject as an artist and think of the work as a kind of a lyrical documentary. As a point of reference and a source of inspiration for my work is the groundbreaking novel by Truman Capote, set in Kansas, titled In Cold Blood. When the book was published in 1966, it created an entirely new genre of literature called new journalism that allows the author to interrogate their own subjective response to actual events. And this photo here was shared with me by a newspaper editor who I photographed, whose father was in this photograph here, and it shows Truman Capote in Kansas doing research and speaking with newspapermen there in Southwest Kansas. So in the past 15 years, the number of working journalists has fallen by more than half. How does one begin to even make sense of that, to take it in? It feels so big and it feels so abstract. I hope the photographs can serve as a way to help us understand the weight of that disappearance. I wanted to show what that loss looks like, to make it tangible, but also serve as a rallying cry. Inside the newspaper offices, I found the rich record of the individual communities and a platform for national concerns. Layers of history visible in every corner, from the meticulous archives to inky fingerprints from printing presses. Realized in a high resolution and rich color, the photographs offer very precise, sensorial descriptions of print media production, past and present. An aluminum printing plate with silhouetted soldiers in silhouette. A photography darkroom. The mechanics of a press humming along as it prints the daily edition. The images celebrate the civic function, labor, and technology at the heart of newspaper production, but also documenting their collective peril. With the photographs of the facades, I wanted to show the newspapers as a part of their community. I wanted to convey the architecture of rural America and the names of these newspaper offices, which I really enjoyed. So this is the Prairie Post in White City, Kansas. Names like the Grass and Grain, the Rural Messenger, the Hillsborough Free Press, the Johnson Pioneer, the Osborne County Farmer, the Montgomery County Chronicle, and the Tiller and Toiler, the newspaper closest to where my mother lives in central Kansas. Together, these photographs create this collective portrait of Kansas, and often the local newspapers are the oldest businesses in their communities. So 2022 turned out to be a really milestone year for me to be making these photographs because many of the newspaper offices in Kansas had recently or were about to reach their 150th anniversary. And I just happened to walk in to the Newton Kansan on the day of their sesquicentennial. A staff member had prepared 3 birthday cakes, a chocolate, a strawberry, and a carrot cake with 150 just stuck in pink, the pink frosting. And they had also laid out a newspaper from their very first edition, their first year, with this bouquet of flowers in the office. So editors I've met across the state inspire me. Many oversee one-person operations, and several do not collect pay, continuing out of a sense of duty. Some are young and just getting started in the business, and some carry forth a family tradition of newspaper ownership since their publication's founding in the mid-1880s. Ink is in their blood. Many, I fear, will not find a replacement to shepherd their institutions to the next generation. In the brief time since I've been making this work, several offices have shut down or been reduced to a mere shadow of their former selves. Even Kansas's most heralded newspaper, the Emporia Gazette. The Gazette was home to William Allen White, the state's most celebrated journalist who, in 1896, wrote the essay, "What's the Matter with Kansas?" An essay, a name of which is still sort of reverberates in contemporary political dialogue. So what is the role of a small town editor? William Allen White wrote in his very first editorial for the Gazette in 1895, "In the first place, the new editor hopes to live here until he is the old editor, until some of the visions which rise before him as dreams shall have come true. He hopes always to sign from Emporia after his name when he is abroad, and trusts that he may endear himself to the people that will be as proud of the first words of the signature as he is of the last. It is likely that he will write the wedding notices of the boys and girls in the schools, that he will announce the birth of the children who will one day honor Emporia, and that he will say the final words of those of middle age who read these lines." So I arrived at this stately two-story office of the Gazette in August, and the name is chiseled across the building. It just feels so like it's etched in stone. You know, it's there, it's meant to be there forever. And I walked up, and the doors are these sort of grand, tall wooden doors. The handles are carved, they're bronze lions in the handles, and I'm pulling at this and found it locked. And it had been the office for 122 years. It was built in 1900 and had continued to be the office until just weeks before I arrived. After gaining access to the space days later, I wandered the cavernous building. In the former wood-paneled office, the sculpted head of a stag lay on the floor, the spider's web clinging between the tines of the antlers. A calendar for July 2022, just weeks prior to my visit, remained eerily taped to a chalkboard in the old newsroom. On the floor of a closet were stacks of linen-bound archives of the newspaper, the brittle pages accumulating in pieces on the floor. So I'm walking around this big open building, and there was this long line of bookshelves, beautiful wooden shelves, you know, built for that space. And I'm looking through them. They all have these doors, and they're all empty. And when I get to the very last one, I open the door, and there is one book left: First Amendment Freedoms. In the main newsroom, all that remained was a mural-sized map that had hung on the wall, which reminded me that these newspapers were once the connection to the world for a community. And later, a former staff member of the Gazette had shared this black and white photograph by a photographer by the name of Michael Dakota. And it showed the same map from this nearly identical vantage point. And his, of course, shows this this room full of people working. There's 4 people on computers. There's 1 on a phone, 2 are reading. The managing editor is peering over the shoulder of one. And Mr. Dakota said to me, it was just a few years after this photo was taken that layoffs and downsizing started. We still had copy editors and reporters that had beats. I think we all knew the end was coming, but none of us imagined how quick everything would change. My experience of arriving at a newspaper office to find an empty building was repeated over and over and over again. The Newton Kansan, the Wellington Daily News, the El Dorado Times, the Chase County Leader News, the Mulberry Advance, and the Dodge City Globe. The Dodge City Globe. At nearly every office, the signs still hung from the vacant building. And in some cases, these newspapers had downsized and moved to smaller locations, often much less accessible places within the community, while others had ceased publication altogether. And this really gave my work a sense of urgency. I was rushing across the state to photograph every office. And time again, I found these really poetic still lives inside. In this is an open dictionary, which was in the Clay Center Dispatch, and I know you're not going to be able to read the words, but in the photograph you would. The first word of the page is disinheritance. The last word on the page is disparagement. I could not have made that up. It's sitting in the lobby. I asked the editor afterwards in an email, does he remember what the last thing that they were researching was, what the context for the open dictionary there might have been? And it was along with a number of questions that I had asked him. And so that one he didn't respond to. And I don't know if he just was like, what? But it's a mystery that I would love to be able to solve. So I often focused on these details in the environment, these features that allow your eye to really touch the patinaed surfaces. And in this photograph, you can read the names of the former employees written in pencil. A detail of that photograph shows Harry, 1951, Joe Hall, last day, June 19th, 1961, Keith, 2007. So this had been a place that people had been signing their name for generations, among others. The storyteller's job is to make the invisible visible. In 2019, a PEN America study concluded, as journalism declines, government officials conduct themselves with less integrity, efficiency, and effectiveness, and corporate malfeasance goes unchecked. With the loss of local news, citizens are less likely to vote, less politically informed, and less likely to run for office. In other words, democracy loses its foundation. In 2005, about 2,200 local newspapers across America had closed. To see these spaces vacated, to find these voices silenced, the presses still, is a way to visualize what is being lost. The forces leading to the closure of newspapers are many. You're probably even better experts than I at this. I'm just gonna go over some. In the early 2000s, the introduction of Craigslist led to a crash in classified advertising. Shortly thereafter, Facebook and Google both began building their companies off the free content of newspapers while absorbing their ad revenue. Online shopping took money away from local businesses that might buy ad space. Then with the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession that followed, newspapers saw what little advertising revenue remained tumble along with circulation numbers. Layoffs and buyouts cut in staff at newspapers at every size. I heard people say over and over again that when they started working for a newspaper, that there were 30 or 40 people in a place that now had 3 or 4. Declining rural populations is another issue facing small-town newspapers. So in January, I was visiting the Signal Enterprise in Alma, Kansas, and they had just printed their year-end issue, which was listed the 2021 reported births and obituaries for Wabunsee County. It was a 2-page spread. It opened up, it was one column, 7 names of births, and 142 obituaries. Each time I print an obituary, an editor tells me, I lose a reader. For many, it was the corporate takeover of local newspapers that spelled the end. The corporations Gannett and Gatehouse Media, the largest and second largest newspaper chains, bought newspapers across the country. They eventually merged, giving the newspaper giant control of 1 out of every 6 newspapers in America. Chad Fry writes, when I started at the Newton Kansan in 1999, there were 35 employees. Circulation was at 8,000 for a 6-day-a-week publication, but times have changed. A corporate cut-your-way-to-prosperity mindset started cutting employees. The very people creating the product were defined as expenses and being shown the door. We were making money, but it wasn't enough. Now there was a corporate structure to support. Chad continues, the newsroom, as it always does, felt it first. People leaving would not be replaced. And in 1999, the newsroom had 7.5 employees. Today, there are 2. The cuts came to the advertising department, and then the press room was completely eliminated in one swoop. Cuts to the business office came next, and the position of the publisher was absorbed into the company. The cuts were no longer around the edges, and they kept coming and coming. The decline of local news works in devastatingly perfect concert with the disinformation machine. So while there's been a loss of local news, there's an increasing spread of disinformation, especially online. The cries of fake news and elected officials that declare journalists enemies of the people. And amongst this noise, our newspapers are quietly closing. On a road map, I marked each town where I'd photographed a newspaper in a gold paint pen, and I was just weaving the state back and forth, and when I got home, I counted these, and they just accumulated like a constellation in the night sky, and I photographed 125 newspaper offices. It was a shock even to me. I recounted and recounted again. And since that time, I've photographed 10 more. And so this is the light, and this is the good news, is the newspapers that endure. Small towns such as Protection, Kansas, with a population of 503, and Coldwater, population 672, still publish newspapers, the Protection Press and the Western Star, respectively. Dotted across the prairie, nearly every 20 to 30 miles, is a newspaper that perseveres. Kansas is the spotlight of America. Her pioneer editors kindled a beacon which flames across the sky to this hour. I found these words in a book titled The History of Kansas Newspapers, published in 1916. And so I was photographing at the Holton Recorder, and the editor, David Powles, pulled this book out of his desk, and he said, look, this desk, it was here when I bought the paper. It was here when my father bought the paper. I think this desk has been here since the paper was published in 1869 and belonged to the first editor. I think this book belonged to the first editor too. And he handed it to me, and it was this fragile book. It had tape holding the spine together, holding the front and the back together. And he handed it to me, he gave it to me to take with me. And he said, so that you might better understand how consequential newspapers are and continue to be, were and continue to be. And David tells me independent community newspapers have never been more important. The book ties the identity of the state and its quest for freedom to the newspapers. Quote, from the first, Kansas regarded the press as her supreme asset. And no other state was the press as a whole ever equal to that of Kansas in either ability or enterprise. This high standard was set up in the stirring territorial period when Kansas was battling for freedom for herself and liberty for America. 162 years after the state's founding, the newspapers still represent a battleground for the freedom of the press and fact-driven journalism. The book provides a first-hand account of Kansas newspapers dating back to 1854 and the territorial days when battles were being waged to determine if Kansas would be a free state or a slave state. The decision, either way, would tip the Union and ultimately lead to the Civil War. This history of the Kansas press, the book argues, is tied to the fact that the state was founded on the ideal that all men should be free. And before statehood, some of the country's brightest minds, editors, preachers, abolitionists, came to Kansas territory to fight for that freedom. Some came with guns and ammo, but their most powerful weapon was the press. They founded newspapers in places not yet settled, becoming the first businesses, even before there was a town or a readership. Another quote from the book: "The first Kansas Banner was a newspaper. It made its advent under an elm tree on the site of Leavenworth, September 15th, 1854. There was not yet a house to be seen, nor any other definite sign of civilization. The printing press preceded all the usual agents of society. It did not wait for the rudimentary clutter of things to be composed and organized. The spirit of adventure thrust it forward ahead of the jail, the post office, the school, the church, and made it a symbol of conquest." By the time Kansas' admission to the Union on January 29, 1861, there were 22 newspapers operating in the territory. By the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, there were 37 newspapers in Kansas, the same number that had existed in the whole country when the Declaration of Independence was declared. And by the turn of that century, there would be over 500 newspapers in Kansas. I found many individuals that continue that rich legacy of Kansas journalism and give me hope that local newspapers will continue to be institutions in their community. People like Susan Len and her son Tim are an example. Susan is the editor and publisher of the Iowa Register, and her family has owned and operated that newspaper since 1867. On a wall in the back of the office hangs a portrait of her, her father, her great-grandfather. Next will probably be the portrait of her son, who had recently moved back from New York to Iowa, Kansas, and is now the managing editor of that paper. He tells me she's probably had the greatest challenges in her time as editor, working during an era of unprecedented change to the industry, and as a woman where only men had stood before. The Iowa Register continues to be a leader in the community, and it will take a stand. So in the recent election to determine abortion rights in Kansas, they published editorial supporting a women's choice. And they lost advertisers, including the largest advertiser in their community, a Catholic church. But that's what it takes to be a leader. You take a hit from time to time. It's exactly that spirit that spoke to me of the importance of newspapers in their communities. An editor like William Allen White often wrote unpopular columns that challenged his community. And people might not know how they felt about an issue, and maybe they didn't even have time to really consider it at all. Just imagine how busy we are in our day-to-day lives. Maybe they didn't agree with him, but he was someone that townspeople knew. It was someone that they might see coming out of the grocery store, someone their kids might have been in school with his kids. People were less likely to dismiss him out of hand. And this is why in polls, even today, even though people's trust in the news has declined, local news is seen as more trustworthy. And this is what we're losing. Editors who are leaders in their community, and newspapers that reflect the needs and concerns of a town, and the offices that hold a community's collective history and their archives. As a young editor, William Allen White imagined 1,000 emporias lighting the landscape in the West. And those lights are fading. Kansas lies at the precipice of a nation's news desert, at its most arid across the western half of the country. This was a piece just published last week in the Washington Post about community news. The loss of newspapers is far greater than ink and paper. It's the fabric which ties a community together and underlies our American democratic experiment. So what happens to a democracy without a free press? On Friday, August 11th, 2023, law enforcement raided the office of the Marion County Record, as well as the homes of the editor and the owners, the reporters, seizing a computer equipment, the routers, cell phones, becoming an international news story. Commenting on the raid in the Kansas Reflector, Eric Meyer had said, "I didn't think it could happen in America." To me and to many, this felt like an inflection point, a warning, as well as an affirmation of our fears. The news quickly became an international news story, and on August 17th, the Washington Post published an opinion piece I'd authored that included 12 photographs from multiple visits that I had made to the Marion County Record. Tim Staffer of the Iowa Register tells me, "The decimation of America's newspapers over the last 2 decades has been well documented. The story has been told, and it's a tragedy. But here we are, still standing, still publishing 5 days a week, still telling our community's story. A newspaper in 2022 informs its readers, sure, but its real purpose is to tie each reader to another, to give its community a spirit, a shared reality, a sense of purpose and possibility." So I grew up in Great Bend, Kansas, a small town in the center of the state. And my mother's family were early settlers to Kansas and continue to maintain a farm that was settled 5 generations ago. And as a young person, I was very eager to escape the plains. Left the day I graduated high school. And these photographs have taught me how much of myself, and especially my aesthetic sensibility, has been shaped by this austere landscape of my native surroundings. And this project is a synthesis of the underlying concerns I've had stretching across my entire career through projects I've pursued over the last decade. Questions of identity, community, democracy. These images are both an ode and an elegy. I hope for them to be an inspiration and a warning, an opus and a love letter to my home state. Soon after I began the project, I found myself interviewing newspaper editors and felt compelled to include their voices in the work. For the past 6 months, I've been working with a graphic designer, a Kansas collaborator, and we just had printed this, just got it back on Thursday from the press. I'm very excited about it. It references a newspaper in scale and design. It's titled The Kansas Mirror, and it features this work, and it includes 10 letters from the editor, authored by men and women across the state of Kansas, newspaper editors. So written in response to our dialogue, these essays cover a diversity of issues and offer a firsthand account of an industry in freefall. Personal and political, they detail the history of the Kansas press and make the case for the importance of local journalism. And inside of the issue is these inserts that unfold to a 16 by 20 photograph, and these are what's on display outside. There's images front and back. So there's 3, kind of a collect all 3 sort of thing. And again, these are fresh off the presses. I'm going to be selling them while I'm here. I'd love for you to come find me. I'll have them in this orange press bag here. And everybody received a copy or will receive a copy. Walk out of here with a copy of The Western Star Still Shines. This is a special edition my graphic designer and I put together specially for the conference. And it details one newspaper in particular, The Western Star, which happened to be the first newspaper that I started photographing, which began this project. And I'm trying to use that as a window to the entire project. I'm very excited about that. I think it gave me a chance to do something different, different than this, and really happy. So that's available for you outside the door. Inside the Kansas Mirror, there's one letter that seems to have been a premonition of things to come. And that was from Eric Meyer of the Marion County Record, and he authored the final essay in the work. I was gonna share with you some of that, but with the time, I want to leave time for questions. So I hope that you'll get it to hear what he has to say, because he's speaking about a community that is divided. He's speaking about the challenges of working in this place, but how he the unique position that he has from this family newspaper to try to shepherd it into the future. So I'm very happy that's included in our paper. So inside the Marion County Record Office, just months prior to the police raid, I photographed a three-dimensional relief of the Kansas state seal hanging on a faded stucco wall. The state motto is evident in the image and provides a source of inspiration. Ad astra per aspera, to the stars through difficulty. Thank you. Leave it to the reporter.
There we go. You mentioned that you hope that this project is also a source of inspiration, a rallying cry. And I guess you kind of touched on that throughout the presentation, but if you could maybe put a finer point on it from your own personal view,
Yeah.
What's the inspiration you draw from this, I guess, in the context of the future of local journalism?
I guess my inspiration through doing this goes through so many layers, because it is both seeing the work that these people do, but also talking to somebody like Tim at the Iola Register. When I read what he contributed to this, first two times I read it, I cried. Like I was so moved by the piece. And so it's not like a singular thing. It really is this collective body of this dedicated group of people that I had to meet that were so sort of focused on it. The Western Star, the paper that is available here, I had asked that gentleman, Dennis, to write something for this, and he was the only one that wasn't able to, but he had a heart attack, and he was hospitalized for a long period of time. And in his absence, two local newspapers in neighboring communities stepped up to make sure his paper came out on time. And he still has never missed an issue in his 46 years, he's proud to tell me. And so there's inspiration that I find, and that little story about that is going to be in that other piece where he writes something for that, and I'm authoring an essay that sort of gives an overall piece. But it's from the people. Inside these places, I just find a great deal of physical beauty. I just think that seeing the layers of history and being in a space that has literally got that history of that community is housed within that physical space is something that is it's hard for me to really put a fine point on it because it's so, there's so many layers to it. I had mentioned how I was so eager to get away from Kansas, and I was. And when I graduated, I left, and here I was. I drove over 10,000 miles in a 6-month period across Kansas, going back and forth, and it was like coming home. It was like coming home over and over and over again. And so I think my experience of making the work has been so overwhelming to me that it's like hard to pinpoint one particular thing. And I don't think the work is over. The work is not over. I really hope to be able to return. And a lot of the photographs I made were of the facades, and I shared some of those with you. And that's because of the speed at which I was working. I just wasn't able to get into all the spaces. And now I really want to extend that record to all the spaces that I wasn't able to visit on my first visit. So stay tuned.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious because circumstances are different. I just wondered if after photographing 135 papers in Kansas, there was any through line for those that are enduring, either with the community support or just kind of the makeup of the paper, something they've done. I just didn't know if you had any observations along those lines.
The ones that felt the healthiest to me were those that were truly locally owned papers, the ones who, usually a family owned those papers. And that was a significant change or a significant difference that I felt every time I walked into that office. I mean, when I walked into the Iola Register, I hadn't even heard of the Iola, I hadn't even heard of Iola, Kansas. I couldn't believe that office. I couldn't believe all the desks, all the people that were working there. And so it was family local ownership seemed to be a significant difference in the state of the newspaper today.
Lovely work, thank you.
Thank
Really
you.
interesting. You touched on it slightly when you brought up the image of the dictionary about, and so my question is, do you alter the image at all? First in shooting it, are you setting any of these, or are you discovering and it's real documentary photography? And kind of what are your considerations as you're that aesthetic, given the subject matter?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So, and this is also something that I was trying to articulate last night in conversation. So I feel like now I've spoken about this work to very different kinds of audiences, and I've spoken about it to photographers. I'm speaking about it to a group now that's going to have a different set of questions. And so, for me, the camera, it's a large format digital camera. So I'm photographing everything on a tripod. It's still, I'm not altering or changing anything. Like that dictionary, I could have never imagined that, that I would find those words together bookending a page. I'm finding stuff in every space that I visit that is far greater than anything I could possibly imagine to create. The difference between the way that I work and, some other artists is I find the world so rich and so beautiful that there's nothing that I could do that would ever compete with that, anything I could imagine to compete with that. So I try to make a photograph that's as authentic to that subject, whatever that subject is, as possible. Because of the low lighting circumstances, everything is on a tripod, so it's long exposure. The camera is so precise in its recording that the images that you see outside at 16 by 20 could be wall size, and you would still be able to see, the fiber of the paper that it's printed on. And so there's a kind of detail. But there was this, in conversation last night, I was saying how, I suspect as a reporter, I was speaking with a reporter, how you want probably every word to have it's a fact. Every word is a precision that when 100 people read what you wrote, they'll come away with the same idea. And I was like, a poet When they write a word, that word is a suggestion. That suggestion could lead 100 people that read it to 100 different conclusions, and that would be a success for that medium. And I am more along the lines of that because I am photographing all of these spaces, not to tell the story of any one newspaper office, and not even really just the newspaper offices in Kansas. I'm trying to really tell a much larger story. And so the way that I'm putting pictures together, the kinds of images I choose are a response to both kind of emotional response that I have in the spaces, but also what just feels so relevant to me when I go in. And of course, this is just what filled this time block. But, this is like a camera. And of course, as a photographer, I'm really drawn to that. And a lot of people were like, well, some of this technology is so old, they can't possibly use this. Well, this newspaper office, when I pulled up, I made a photograph of the facade, which is what I always do. And I didn't realize it at first. In the frame were 2 jugs of darkroom chemistry warming up in the sun because he was coming to shoot. He was cutting and pasting his newspaper still with an X-Acto. I made a portrait of him. And I didn't realize he was holding the X-Acto knife in his hand, and he was pasting it. And this was a man who'd returned from the Vietnam War and started working this paper, which had the smallest circulation of any newspaper in Kansas for a while, circulation of I think 56. But it was also just down the road from the former site of a newspaper which had the greatest circulation, over 500,000 for the Call to Reason, a socialist newspaper at the turn of the century. And so that sort of like geographic proximity just speaks to the kind of richness of this subject in this place. And so when I go back, one of the things I really want to do is spend a lot of time with archives, archived materials. And I was talking about a real cache of photographs I'd come across in the Hayes newspaper that I'm really anxious to do something with too. So I'm hoping that answers your question.
Hi there. I also just wanted to thank you so much for this work right here. I also am a former Kansan. I also left after graduation in high school and then went to Yale University for 4 years and then graduated this last May and still, as you do, continue to think about home, rural places. I'm here. You're also wearing a sunflower. And so I guess
State flower, Kansas.
Yeah. I guess I'm just curious, and if you could speak a little bit more about how you brought your identity to this work, not only as a Kansan, but as somebody who left, and kind of how that impacted your eye and how you came into these communities and viewed them, and kind of, just how it informed.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that I probably don't have a good answer for because it's this question of identity. It was not even something that really I understood until after I'd made this work. It wasn't until I was really looking at prints that I'd made hanging up on the studio. And I was realizing that some of these towns I'd photographed were the first places that I ever visited with a camera. Like when I was going off to college and I was where the Tiller and Toiler is in Larned, Kansas, I'd made a photograph of that building when I first learned to use a camera. And so there was this connection that felt so deep that was cellular. It was sort of beyond my intellect to sort of process. And as I've started, thinking about this work in a little bit of hindsight now I'm sort of realizing how much, and if I look at these pictures in relationship to those very first pictures I made, the relationship is so clear that I'm just sort of startled by the similarity of aesthetics, just purely kind of the subject matter and aesthetics, not necessarily subject matter. But I'm working to define that. Thank you.
Thank you. These are beautiful photographs, and I really appreciate your work. I'm not a Kansan, but I have lots of friends who are, and I love them. And I've been to Kansas many times. Just I don't know if you were here for the opening plenary this morning, but hearkening back to some of the things we heard there about the population loss that you did mention, and the need to attract new people into our rural emptying places. I'm just curious if it ever came up in your conversations with the newspaper folk about how to bring the voices of the newcomers, whether they're from other parts of the United States or other parts of the world, into the journalism, the local journalism, since they have stories too, and we need to hear their stories, and to kind of counterpoint the nostalgia with the future and who's going to tell that story for Kansas and for all of us.
Well, one of the portraits that I showed was of Whitney Hodgen, who is the editor of the Dodge City Daily Globe today, and she's a young editor that just recently took the helm of that paper. And I think that that's kind of been a little conversation that her and I have continued to have. She's also a contributor to this piece here, the Kansas Mirror, and it's another question I'm afraid I don't really have a good answer to. I mean, that if I'm thinking of the population loss, like, I would like to be one of those numbers that adds to the population. I'm trying to find a way to return to Kansas to live. It's a place I would like to be. And, the field work for this was done last year over the course of a pretty condensed period of time. And it was so focused that I'm really only now processing kind of everything that I've done. And, I did so many interviews that I've not even had a chance to touch any of that material. I have so much more information that I'm slowly beginning to think about in writing the piece for the Washington Post. I'm not a natural writer. I'm a photographer, but it's really given me a subject to sort of try to reflect on that. I did write an essay for the piece that's out there, and have written a handful of other things in the last year that sort of speak to Kansas as both my biographical and the connections to that place, but also its sort of geographic sort of interest and pulls. So in another year or so, I had hoped I would have a better answer for you. It's still so fresh for me, Yeah.
This will be quick, but when can I buy the book?
Well, you can get this right now afterwards. So I'm selling these for $20. I'll tell you, I could not be more happy with the way they turned out. It was really meant to be like styled after a newspaper. We had a series of proofs, but the reproduction quality. So I was teetering between wanting to do like a newspaper, something that really felt like a newspaper, but then also wanted to have something that would really honor those images and their reproduction. And I'd had this idea pretty early on. Ultimately, because I imagined this project to unfold in a series of publications like this, then I could imagine in my dream for the future that these would be collectively published in a book that would sort of act like one of the archives that I've showed here today. And so I'm going to be thinking about that, but I have years of work left to do until it reaches that point. But $20 today, and it includes that 20 and 16 by 20 insert that unfolds. So Godspeed. Yes.
Hi, University of Missouri alum. Sorry.
Ah, hey.
You read a quote that mentioned community newspapers providing communities with a shared reality, and I was wondering if, in your travels through these communities, what your sense was of how aware the people in that community were of what was happening around them with, this great collapse of local news.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so when I was doing this in the fall, like the midterm elections were imminent. Like it was a time in which it was where I felt like, oh my gosh, we have really just no idea of what's going to happen to the future, like right now. So as I was going from community to community, like this is what is happening in real time across the country. Of course, like I'm feeling that very acutely. I tended not to engage in that many political conversations when I was making the work, because I didn't want to alienate somebody. I wanted to ingratiate myself in order to gain the access to make the photographs that I was. And so the conversations probably did not really go as deep as might have revealed those kind of answers. And 125 in 6 months, I was like moving pretty quickly. So yeah, if that helps. I remember just had such a feeling of dread as I was driving, and there was a photograph that I had made just outside of one of the newspaper offices, and it said Trump in spray paint over, it was like a state park sign. And then somebody had spray painted in red on top of the black, fraud. But the lower one had been partially removed, and so it wasn't even clear if the fraud was meant to be the election or Trump, and because fraud was painted after the T had been, or after part of that first sign had been removed, and it was like this question mark, like what are they responding to? What is in the air? I can't tell. I don't know what is going to happen. And so that's a picture that's part of that sprawling body of work that I described earlier. The hard traveling battleground blues. It's the title of that project.
I was really struck by the images of the archives moldering. I think a lot of us have seen dumpsters filled with history, and it's heartbreaking. And I'm wondering, I know you mentioned you were going to be digging into archives more on your next one, and to me the interplay of how newspapers not only tell our stories, but they hold our histories. And as we see these things fall, are we also seeing a requiem for history of place?
Yeah. So I was really sort of reluctant to do much with the archives other than make a record of them when I was there, in part because I didn't want the photographs to feel so rooted in the past. For me, the photographs are suggestive of the past, they document the future, and they signal a future. They document the present and signal a future. And I didn't want them to get locked in to a past. And so the thing which is motivating me now to want to go back and revisit those archives is really the two things. This newspaper, The Call to Reason, that I had learned about. Unfortunately, the building that had been in had burned to the ground, so it is no longer, it's a slab now. And it was this huge, the Hayes Daily News, that newspaper had been purchased by, the building that had operated the Hayes Daily News had been purchased by a gentleman who was using it for something else, and he was clearing out that space and had hired a demo crew to come in and just get rid of everything. And then he read about what I was doing in a newspaper, and he contacted me, said, hey, I got something you might be interested in. I bought this newspaper, and I bought this building, and it's got all of this material from the newspaper. You should come have a look. And he told me that he came in while the demo crew was getting rid of everything in these metal dumpsters, and he just happened to walk in to see them throw out a black and white photograph that was a friend of his from high school that he played football with. And so it was that personal connection. As that photograph was going to the trash, he was like, wait a minute, don't throw anything else away. I don't know what I'm going to do with this, but it feels more important now. And so that's, he called me, and it was, for me, seeing what was this collection of photographs made between the late 70s and early 80s, which was also the time that I was living there. The first years of my life were spent in Hayes. And so here's this collection of black and white photographs that no longer has any context. We don't know what stories they were, don't know who made the photographs, no other information, but they're remarkable pictures. They really are just, as they stand alone, they're really truly remarkable photographs. And woven together, I think they create this really interesting poem of that particular place. And so when I'm using the archives, I don't want them just to be a nod to the past. I really want to use them as some way to look towards the future. Okay, thank you.
Jeremiah, that was just so moving. We really appreciate you sharing that journey with us. Very important. We're going to take about a 15-minute break before we have our third and final session. So stretch your legs, and we'll see you back here to get started right at 2 o'clock.